It's no secret that F1 is known as the Billionaire Boys Club, but what if I told you that not all F1 drivers were born with a silver spoon in their mouth, and in fact, some drivers have effectively gone from rags to riches. So, let's take a look at the insane differences between some of the richest and poorest Formula 1 drivers. Before he was winning races and cruising around on yachts, Kimi Raikkonen had a less than lavish childhood. In fact, the Iceman's upbringing couldn't have been further from the lifestyle he has today. This small greenhouse is his childhood home, and it was hand-built by his great-grandfather. It not only lacked basic facilities such as an indoor bathroom or any plumbing, but was also located in a Finnish forest, which was literally swarming with bears and wolves. I mean, talk about tough. Despite these adversities, Kimi's need for speed began to show at just 3 years old. Like most normal 3-year-olds, he would often be found tearing around the neighborhood on his miniature motocross bike. In the following years, Kimi's love for karting began to develop, with his dad even making him a homemade go-kart to practice on, since they couldn't afford the real deal. But honestly, I'm sure Kimi could still lap faster in that than Lance Stroll in his Aston Martin. At the tender age of 10 years old, Raikkonen would begin karting competitively, and this is where his talent really began to shine. But whilst Kimi was a speed demon on track, the expenses for karting were mounting, and they put a humongous financial burden on his family. At one point, his father had to work 3 jobs just to make enough money to take Kimi racing on the weekends. They managed to scrape enough money together to buy this old rundown van, which they used as Kimi's mobile workstation. But his parents' sacrifices would prove to be worth it, as Kimi made his mark on the national and international racing stage, which attracted sponsorships from around the world, and the rest is history. On the other end of the spectrum is everyone's favourite Turn 1 bottler, Lando Norris. All jokes aside, Norris comes from one of the wealthiest families in the UK, with his dad estimated to have amassed a £200 million fortune throughout his time as a pensions director. But karting wasn't Lando's first sporting venture, as he first tried his hand at motorcycle riding, quad biking, and even horse riding before he would enter the UK karting scene at the age of 7. With his undeniable talent and financial backing from his father, Lando had no problems rising to the top of the sport, as the financial burden of karting wasn't a concern for Lando. He could compete in multiple karting championships without worry. After winning numerous karting championships, Lando would begin his ascension through the lower Formula Series with his father's financial backing, before eventually landing a seat at McLaren in 2019. Whilst Lando didn't exactly have it rough growing up, at least he's proven himself through his own merit and talent, unlike a certain somebody later on in this list. Esteban Ocon arguably has one of the most well-known rags to riches stories on the Formula 1 grid. Esteban was born to a modest family in the north of France who weren't wealthy by any stretch of the imagination. His parents, Laurent and Sabrina, owned a small automotive garage where they worked hard to earn a living. Whilst his life up until this point might sound fairly normal, things took a dramatic turn once Ocon entered the world of karting at 7 years old. In Esteban's first few years karting, he showcased his natural skill behind the wheel, rising through the ranks and winning all manner of events. But traveling to these races every weekend took a serious toll on the family, with the karting expenses eventually bringing them to the brink of financial ruin. They now faced 2 options: end Esteban's motorsport dream, or risk it all and sell their house and garage to fund their son's career. And I guess you all know which option they chose. The family was now effectively homeless and had to resort to living in a caravan for the coming years. Ocon was no longer just racing for himself, but he was racing for the sake of his family, who had sacrificed everything for their son. After years of dedication and persistence, Ocon finally got his big break in 2011, when Gravity Sports Management signed him, providing him with the financial backing needed to begin his single-seater career and eventually progress into Formula 1. So, even if, like me, you're not exactly Ocon's biggest fan, you really have to admire the dedication and belief that his family had in him from day one. Lance Stroll comes from a level of wealth that you and I can only dream of. I mean, his dad is literally a billionaire, so he wasn't exactly strapped for cash growing up. Daddy Stroll's love for motorsport had been evident for years, as he owned an entire racetrack in Canada, as well as a car collection estimated to be worth over $180 million. So naturally, his love for racing rubbed off onto Lance. When the time came for Lance to join karting, Lawrence threw as much cash as possible at his son, buying him the best equipment and opportunities. After a few years of flying around to karting events across all of North America, Lance would make the step into single-seater racing. This is when his dad really started to flex his wealth. Before Lance even dipped his toe into Formula 4, his dad invested a reported $60 million into the Prima racing team, which his son would go on to join. This funding allowed Lance to have the very best simulators, equipment, and cars, and supported him in winning the 2014 Italian F4 Championship. Lance then progressed onto Formula 3, once again with Prima Racing. After 2 years and millions of dollars spent in Formula 3, Lance claimed the championship and was set to join Williams for the 2017 season. Now, you might be thinking that surely Lance must have been a generational talent if he got to skip Formula 2 entirely, a move which is usually only reserved for the likes of Max Verstappen. Well, that's not exactly the case. You see, his dad actually paid Williams a reported $80 million before his son's debut. So, once again, Lance's wealth worked massively in his favor. I think this clip really summarizes Lance's career as a whole.
You see, Weasley, unlike some, my father can afford the best.
As if buying his way into the sport wasn't enough, just a few years later, Lance's dad would end up buying a whole Formula 1 team for his son, which then became Aston Martin, where Stroll still races to this day. I mean, if that doesn't show you the difference in wealth between some of these drivers, I don't know what will. Aside from being the only certified Sigma on track, Fernando Alonso is arguably one of the most talented drivers in F1 history. But his rise to the top wasn't just gifted to him like some. Alonso's family was working class, with his father working as a mineshaft explosives mechanic and his mother working in the local department store. Alonso's father had a small amount of karting experience in his youth and wanted to share his passion with his children. He hand-built a go-kart that was actually intended for Fernando's older sister Lorena, but after she showed little interest in the kart, it was instead passed on to Fernando, who fell in love. By the time he was just 5 years old, he was granted a karting license by the local federation and would practice at every opportunity he could get. Coming from a poorer family meant Alonso couldn't afford the racing equipment needed for competitive karting, so his mum had to hand-sew his racing suits together, whilst his dad worked as his technician and mechanic. He even had to race on slick tires in the rain because his family couldn't afford wet tires for him to race on. But what Alonso lacked in equipment, he made up for in raw talent, as he would go on to win his first karting race at just 7 years old. After a flurry of impressive performances, his affinity behind the wheel was recognized by a local karting track owner, who helped Fernando secure sponsorships and funding that allowed him to progress his career to become the legendary driver that we all love today.